He delivered at Juilliard School of the Arts in New York City in 2005. I think Ed and I we thought we had a pretty good idea of what we were getting into when we started reading through the speeches, but there were a handful of very big surprises. There's a speech at a wild turkey hunting convention. Which, I didn't know he did that. Twice. He did, yeah, twice. Came back for more. And that's included in here. And then there was this one, which is a little bit different from the wild turkey hunting convention speech. Delivered it at Juilliard to celebrate the school's 100th anniversary. He was invited by the school's president, Joseph Polisi, because Mr. Polisi knew that my dad loved opera and was a fan of the arts, so it was a good fit for that reason. And to his credit, Mr. Polisi invited my dad because he knew my dad would offer opinions that the people at that school and at that event wouldn't otherwise encounter. So he expected my dad to kind of challenge them in a way. Mr. Polisi told me that my father was a little bit reluctant, but was eventually talked into going. And he ended up being part of a panel about the arts in American society, a panel along with Stephen Sondheim, the Broadway composer, who also co-wrote Officer Krupke, which was one of my dad's favorite songs. He used to sing it around the house and included it in a dissent, right? Or not the whole song, but a line from the song. He sang it from the bench. It was impressive. I don't think my father knew that Sondheim co-wrote that song. I wish I had told him in advance. And then Renee Fleming was also on the panel, an opera singer, and the historian David McCulloch. So it was a very interesting group, and my father recognized that he was a little out of place in that group. But one of the reasons I love that speech is just because of the context, and the speech itself is fantastic as well. He begins the speech by acknowledging how out of place he seems. I am happy to be here this afternoon, and to tell you the truth, somewhat surprised to be here this afternoon. Today's program reads like some sort of IQ test. Which of the following is out of place? Diva, author, composer, lawyer. These speeches are full of self-deprecating humor like that, but I love this speech because it's just so marvelously constructed. He begins by making fun of himself, wins the audience over by doing that, but then defends his presence there by arguing that lawyers actually are important to the arts. He says early in the speech, while lawyers do not sing grand opera, they provide the conditions for those who have that talent to make a living at it. And he explains the importance of contract law in the arts, and specifically for opera. So he wins them over a little bit, gets their respect, but then in the second half of the speech, he discusses the First Amendment, and that's where he challenges them. My father liked to challenge people in his speeches. Even if he agreed with an organization or a group of people about 99.9% of an issue or life in general, he would find that minute point of disagreement and explore that and discuss that and challenge them. And so in this instance, he discusses the limits of the First Amendment. And he says, for example, the First Amendment says what it says, not what we lovers of the arts would like it to say. And frankly, I find it impossible to stretch the freedom of speech and of the press beyond those symbols, including even symbolic actions, that convey thought as opposed to aesthetic, or for that matter, erotic emotions. This means, I'm sorry to say, that in my view, even music, as opposed to lyrics, is not covered. The First Amendment forbids the censoring of operas because their librettos are revolutionary, as the kings of Europe used to do, but it does not forbid censoring them because their music is lousy. And then he concludes this paragraph with one of his most famous lines, I think. Somebody even sent him a stamp to this, a rubber stamp to this extent. But not everything that is stupid is unconstitutional. So he ends by challenging the audience, explaining from an originalist perspective, obviously, what some of the limitations of the First Amendment are. And then he ends that speech with another one of his favorite, or one of his hobby horses really, that the Bill of Rights is great, but without the structure guaranteed by the preceding articles, the Bill of Rights is nothing. And well, that's an overstatement, I guess. But so he says, pursuant to that structure of government and democratic tradition, subjects not covered by the Constitution's words, even subjects on which people have passionately held opposing views, are to be resolved by open debate, rational persuasion, and prudent compromise. That produces a body of laws that may seem dull beside the inspiring provisions of the Bill of Rights, but that provide the conditions essential to the flourishing of the arts. So again, it's the context and it's just the structure of the speech and the personality that comes through that I like so much about that one. And very quickly, another one I really like is one of the tributes that he delivered. And this one was for Emerson Spees, who had been dean of the UVA Law School when my father was there. I like this one in part because it describes my family before I was alive. I didn't realize there had been happiness in my family before 1975. So this speech was a real revelation. But it includes some beautiful writing, as a lot of the eulogies do. I just want to, this is, my brother Gene up here really likes the short story writer Peter Taylor, who was at UVA for a little while. And this struck me just as like a passage from a Peter Taylor story. My father's describing Emerson Spees. My older siblings used to call him Uncle Emerson, his love for growing azaleas and spending time at the cottage, a cottage he had. There, those who are fortunate enough to have experienced it will recall another aspect of Emerson's life, Emerson the azalea grower. I suppose there are more impressive displays of azaleas somewhere, perhaps in the Arboretum in Washington, but I have never enjoyed anything as much as the spring party Emerson used to throw for the faculty, when we would stroll through several acres of resplendent azaleas, gin and tonics in hand, taking only slightly more pleasure in the flowers than we did in Emerson's childlike delight at having produced them. There are beautiful passages in here, and Judge Sutton was suggesting that, okay, Jeff, sorry, was suggesting that these are in some ways more enjoyable than the opinions. Certainly you won't get a passage like that in his opinions. That's one reason I so enjoyed working on this collection. Thank you.
All right, Ed.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, as someone who so deeply admired the justice and who grieved over his death, it was such a great pleasure for me to work on this project, and often just downright fun. As others have indicated, the Justice's voice, you hear with every speech. I see his gestures, I know when he's laughing, and everyone, whether you knew him or not, his voice is so distinctive that will come across to you. Nearly all of the speeches in this book had never been published anywhere before. A handful you can find somewhere online, but 90% of these are entirely new to the public, and this is very much aimed for a general audience. This really is not Justice Scalia narrowly, but Antonin Scalia, the man in full. The man of faith and family and friendship, to continue the alliteration, the man of formation, moral formation in civic education to be good citizens. And most broadly, this is about one man's very coherent, comprehensive view, lived out in his life, of what it means to be an American. What our founding principles are about, how to sustain this American experiment, which he recognized was fragile and not guaranteed to prevail. I'm going to also quote from two of his speeches. One is on games and sports. It begins, I've been asked many, many times, to what do I attribute my well-known athletic prowess? The Justice then goes on to give a charming account of the games and sports that he played in his youth in Queens. Things like scoop ball, stickball, street hockey, and something called ringoledio. It's just this wonderful account of what life was like in that period. I'm going to read one more passage from this. he explains that there were no such things back then as soccer moms for various reasons. First of all, soccer momming is impossible without a car, and only a couple of people in our neighborhood had cars, mainly for show. The third reason there were no soccer moms is because there was no soccer. Americans overwhelmingly preferred baseball, a game in which a lot of players stand around while not much happens, to soccer, a game in which people run back and forth furiously while not much happens.
I dissent on that. I dissent on that one.
The second speech I'd like to quote a passage from is on the Italian view of the Irish. The book actually begins with a section of speeches on the American people and ethnicity. And you'll see in these speeches that Justice Scalia loved distinctive ethnicities and regionalisms. He appreciated our cultural and ethnic diversity in a way that I think a lot of multiculturalists today really don't. He loved the differences, savored them, and yes, sometimes poked gentle fun at them. So for the passage I'm going to read, you need to have in mind that Justice Scalia's bride of 55 plus years was born Maureen McCarthy. The first appealing quality about the Irish, as seen by us subtle Italians, is their bluntness. There is very little beating about the bush with them. You always know where you stand. My wife Maureen has this endearing quality to a preeminent degree. An example that occurs to me is not really Maureen's own line, but a cartoon obviously inspired by an Irishman, which he left on the breakfast table shortly after I'd been confirmed to the Supreme Court. It shows a stern-looking paunchy fellow sitting at the breakfast table across from his wife, reading the paper, and Maureen, the wife in the cartoon, is saying, while you are a conservative jurist who believes in judicial restraint, you are also a louse. He goes on to celebrate many other qualities of the Irish in that speech. There's so much more I could talk about here. The speeches on faith, I think, really go to the so much the core of what Justice Scalia was. At the same time, there's an important speech on faith and judging that emphasizes the sharp divide that he drew between his faith and his role as a judge. A very important speech that I think, gathering from recent events, lots of folks, at least on the other side of the ideological aisle, don't seem to understand very well. But with that, happy to pass it back to you, Jeff.
All right, thank you, Ed. Well, federal judges moderate these panels. They're not supposed to carry much water, but I can't resist commenting about two of the speeches. I think I'm the oldest one on the panel, so I focused on the eulogies. As Rachel pointed out, they're a wonderful way to get an insight into people because the eulogizer usually eventually becomes the eulogizee when it comes to values they choose to focus on. So let me start with one. This was a fellow I've never heard of, Morris Liebman, I think goes by Maury. And in the wind-up to the key part of the eulogy, he begins by saying, I frankly don't know how smart Maury was. Now that comment might explain why there are only 5 eulogies in the book. Didn't get invited too often. But then he says, now I don't consider that speaking ill of the dead, because I have never thought that smarts counted for that much. Coming from Justice Scalia. My father used to tell me that brains are like muscles, they can be hired by the hour. It is character and judgment that are not for sale. That explains why George Washington was his favorite founding father. So the other one is about another theme in the eulogies when it comes to the judges, separation of law from personal belief. This is about a Judge Richard Casey from the Southern District of New York. I too was not aware of him. He's deciding a partial birth abortion case after the Supreme Court's first partial birth abortion ruling. So in his opinion, he did a bunch of fact-finding, had some discovery, evidence was submitted, and he made this finding of fact, that the procedure, quote, is as gruesome, a brutal, barbaric, and uncivilized a medical procedure as there is, but then proceeded to uphold it. Justice Scalia then says, he then compliments the judge's unbending fidelity to the judicial oath, and here's the key point: I can bestow no higher professional praise on a man whose religious values were such a pivotal part of his extraordinary life than to command his humble recognition that there is a line between law and personal belief. That was Justice Scalia. So let's go back to our panelists. Christopher, you're a writer. The justice is a writer. What are your thoughts about his passion for writing?
He was passionate about writing.
Okay, Amy.
There's a great speech in here called Writing Well that he delivered to an organization called Scribes, which is an organization of lawyers dedicated to improving the quality of legal writing. They gave him the Lifetime Achievement Award. And he began that acceptance speech by complaining about the name of the award, by the way. He said, you've got to change the name of this thing. But in that speech, he described the time and sweat that was necessary to write well. I asked him once when I was trying to write well myself whether writing came easy to him, and he said, "No, it's hard as hell." And obviously that was a great relief to me. And you know, I should have known that because I saw him working on it. Anybody who lived in that house, and obviously anybody who worked with him, would see him not just reading the briefs, but writing drafts and typing drafts and staring at the glowing monitor late at night and on weekends. He liked to tell the story of a professor he had his freshman year at Georgetown, Professor Orr, who was a difficult professor. He assigned an essay every week, and every week my dad worked hard on it, and every week the essay came back with a relatively low grade, I mean, by a nerd standard. And my dad, it just inspired my dad to work hard, and he never forgot that professor. I mean, up until years before he died, he was telling me that story. I just, as a writer, when I try to write myself, I just remember the hard work he put into it. And you know, he liked to use the old line of, I don't like writing, but I like having written. It's a difficult process, but when you do it well, there's a great sense of pride from it. And I think he also tried to teach us that lesson of hard work and the pride you get from it by all the yard work he gave us too. But I would have preferred more writing assignments, actually.
Did he review a lot of your essays, or was it Mrs. Scalia that was in charge of reviewing all the homework?
Neither of them did really. They weren't very helicoptery in that regard. I remember my dad helping me.
9 children does that
Yeah,
to you.
exactly. Yeah. They just gave up. He helped me a little bit with my senior thesis in college. Read a page and found a couple of instances of poorly chosen words.
So Ed, you and Chris both had the honor of really a privilege that I think everybody in this room would have enjoyed, of going through all these speeches, deciding which ones to publish, which not, to edit them, have these great captions for them. Is there anything about that experience that's worth sharing? I'm particularly curious how many are on the cutting room floor, or perhaps more hopefully might get into another book.
Well, we really had no idea what we would find when we were asked to undertake this project. I thought there might be 6 speeches that he gave year in, year out, and have a thin volume. And you know, the speeches were not well organized, it's fair to say. We had different databases electronically and binders here and there. And the first big project was to sort through them, and it was just wonderful to discover. It only took a day or so to say, wow, there's so much here. This is so fun to read through. Speeches on such a broad range of topics that we just simply didn't anticipate.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's so striking about the book is the justice's breadth, which, you know, was brought to him by, you know, the 9 children he had at home. He was so widely read in American history, loved music, loved literature, and, you know, as I read the book, you know, when I first heard that Ed and Chris were doing this, I kind of assumed it was going to be primarily pitched to lawyers. but it's hard for me to imagine who wouldn't benefit from reading it because of the breadth. It hits something for everyone. I mean, my high school daughter, I'm gonna give my high school daughter one for Christmas, because it hits so much. And one thing that I think is so endearing about the justice, and this goes to the George Washington point and to the, the smarts of in the eulogy, is that despite the fact that he himself was brilliant and he inhabited a world of intellectual elites, that wasn't the thing he valued the most. And he said outright of George Washington, he was not the smartest founder, yet he was still the one that the justice most respected. And that just goes to the justice's character and his core.
Well, another way to think about the Washington point is the smartest founders all respected Washington. And it also says something about Washington. Do you guys want to add any closing remarks before we offer time for questions?
Sure, I think you see in this book capacity for friendship. A capacity that I think ultimately was rooted in his Catholic faith. But you see in the foreword by his longtime dear friend, Justice Ginsburg, her account of how they became friends, and they had a very special friendship, a friendship that I think shows the justice's ability to appreciate the good qualities in others, even while not abandoning or compromising his beliefs at all. And you likewise see that same tremendous capacity for trans-ideological friendship in some of the eulogies that have been mentioned.
Maybe partly because he loved to argue.
Well, and he loved to argue because he saw argument, honest argument, good faith argument, as a vehicle for pursuing the truth, not scoring points. And he understood that if you actually engage with someone and listen to them, and they listen to you, maybe you'll have a better understanding of the points on which you really disagree. Maybe you'll persuade each other on some points. But again, argument is a path to truth. And I think what, in some ways, really, the times we drive him crazy on the court, would be those colleagues who would not argue. Now, I remember when I interviewed for the clerkship, reading lots of opinions where Justice Scalia had written a dissent. I'd read the dissent and say, wow, this sure seems like a killer point. Let me go back and see what the majority had to say in response to this. Time after time, the answer was nothing. They had their 5 votes, and they had nothing to say. They weren't going to bother trying to answer. This ties into the writing point too, if I may be brief here. It was wonderful. I'm sure you